Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 17th February 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We also have a guest with us. Well, we're delighted to say that we are now just about operational in our new location. And although you may see a few minor differences on screen today, the studio is completely different from our old studio, and we're going to be able to do some very exciting things here. More on that over the coming days.
We'll just say apologies for the slight delay in the programme.
Apologies for the slight technical delay. We'll add that obviously the weather hasn't improved in the new location. It's quite horrific here in Plymouth today, the rain hammering down. So if you're enjoying a bit of brightness in Norfolk or just a bit of gentle overcast weather in Pembrokeshire, you're doing quite well. Well, we're probably back online at just the right time because we're seeing extraordinary things unfold worldwide and of course in UK, and much of that relating to the immense progress of the European Union. But you're going to start us off, Mike, with Syria.
Yeah, because obviously over the last few days, the conversation, since we have been on air, in fact, the conversation, a lot of it has been dominated by the bombing of the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Syria. So MSF reporting here that the attack occurred. There were 25 members of staff in the hospital. 5 staff members have been confirmed killed. 3 were recovered from the rubble with injuries. And the death toll at the time of publication of this, which was a couple of days, well, the update was yesterday, the death toll was 11 and likely to rise. Now, of course, unsurprisingly, perhaps Russia was getting the blame for these 2 missile attacks. The 2 attacks came within minutes of each other. Russia, of course, denies this. The Independent here pointing that out. And this is Russia's spokesperson, Peskov, who gave a conference call with journalists, and he basically said that the people who make accusations such as this should do as Moscow does and rely on primary source information. Their primary source information is the Syrian government. But he said, we categorically reject such claims, even more so because each time those who make such claims prove unable somehow to corroborate their unsubstantiated accusations. Now, I have to say that MSF seems very unlucky with their hospitals. None of the previous bad luck has been the result of Russian bombings, though. But it is interesting that they would choose to keep the location of this particular hospital secret. Brian,
to avoid being bombed.
To avoid being bombed. This is being. FP is claiming this as an exclusive. So this is Foreign Policy magazine, and they're saying that the MSF kept the location secret. Surely, if you're in a bomb zone somewhere that's being attacked by bombs, you would paint a big sign on the roof saying this is a hospital.
Well, of course, military vehicles have the Red Cross on them for that specific purpose. In most cases, of course, if you attack these sorts of targets, it's going to do you harm. So this is not logical.
Indeed. So anyway, MSF, as I say, pretty unlucky. In January, it was Saudi Arabia causing the trouble, and that was being done in Yemen. They were pointing out that they'd been attacked 4 times in less than 3 months. So the first attack was on the 20th of October last year. Then there was another one, a mobile clinic hit by Saudi coalition forces in Yemen on the 2nd of December. And then on the 10th of January, a hospital came under attack and 6 people killed and 7 injured. And on the 21st of January, an MSF ambulance was hit. So they're not really having much luck. And of course, aside from Saudi Arabia, the only Western or the only sort of mainstream government power that has absolutely been confirmed to have bombed Médecins Sans Frontières hospitals is the United States. And that was in Afghanistan on the 3rd of October last year. That killed 3 staff and 30 civilians. And so you've got to ask, Brian, what is going on with Médecins Sans Frontières that they in particular are being targeted?
Well, I think we're allowed to say they're clearly being used for political purposes. They are not just there for the health and welfare of people on the ground. There's another political agenda going on in the background. I think there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, okay. But sticking with Syria then, this is again Foreign Policy magazine. Syria ceasefire brings Turkey closer to war. And so what we seem to be seeing is because Russia and the Syrian government really subverting the Western agenda here, we're seeing a clear intention to expand the war, make it a more general war. It's already known that Turkey and Saudi are working towards boots on the ground. And in fact, although it's not fair to say that there's no opposition within Turkey, because the Turkish opposition parties are absolutely against this. The Republican People's Party, they've said they are against all decisions to plunge Turkey into war. And their leader said Turkey should not lend armed support to jihadist groups within Syria. So they're coming out and absolutely suggesting that their own government are providing arms and support to ISIS and others. Then the Nationalist Movement Party, another opposition party, said if a military operation is being planned in the name of executing or assisting global projects and cooperation is being forged with Saudi Arabia to that effect, the results could be terrible. It could lead to unimaginably grave consequences. And he went on to say Turkey will not be proxy to execute scenarios of violence and atrocity drafted in foreign capitals. So again, even the Turkish opposition parties recognizing what the source of this war is. It's not Syria, it's not the Middle East, it's the West, basically.
It's the West with help from the Saudis. And of course, we had over the weekend the Saudi foreign minister saying, well, our money has been misused. We haven't actually funded terror. We haven't been funding ISIS. It's some naughty person has misused our money.
Oh, well then. Okay.
There we go.
There we go. And Turkey, the Turkish government, of course, absolutely in the pockets of the Western powers. And they are now working towards opening a second front with Russia in the Ukraine. This article here is the first, talking about the first in a series of meetings to be held this year, building a, quote, strategic alliance so this meeting was between the Turkish Prime Minister and the Ukrainian President. The Turkish Prime Minister said that basically Russia is a terrorist organization. And he charged Russia with invading Iraq, Georgia and Syria, and therefore they've got to be dealt with.
Well, I shouldn't laugh because it's so serious, but of course the whole problem is that Russia's policy in Syria is working. UK and the US have been now forced on the sideline, so all they can do is throw abuse at President Putin and the Russians, Mike.
Right.
And
well,
this is a theme in some of the other news that we've got today.
Indeed, and it shouldn't be forgotten, of course, who is a key placeman in the Ukraine, in Odessa, in fact, and that's Mikhail Saakashvili, ex-Georgian president and George Soros frontman. We'll be talking about Soros in a minute. Of course, in 2008, when he was deployed to start the South Ossetian war against Russia, he said, and I quote, "We are the fighting ground for a new world war." So this man is off his head. He has been off his head for years, and he is in a key position to exist with creating exactly that, particularly if Turkey and Ukraine start to sort of attempt to poke a stick in at Russia.
Yeah. So everything is being stoked up at the moment.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to highlight this article from New Eastern Outlook. Operation Barbarossa II, American occupation of Europe intensifies. Don't agree with everything that's in the article, but the points are quite interesting because Christopher Black here is talking about Operation Barbarossa, which of course was the Nazi takeover of Europe. And he's basically just drawing some parallels with the current situation. It is an interesting map, is it not?
Well, of course, many people say if you follow the origins of the EU, you go back to the end of the Nazi regime. And this is one of the things that people like Christopher Booker, Richard North, Dave Barmby, who was with us recently, are all pointing out that when we go back to the political origins, you're coming back to the end of the Nazi era and the start of the new Europe.
Well,
so to be expected, I think.
Well, one of the key points Christopher Black makes, of course, is that the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was signed in 1997, stipulates that neither side can place forces on their respective borders. So NATO clearly in breach with that at the moment.
Well, and have been for some time, Mike, plus the aggression of moving troops right up onto the Russian border.
Okay, and of course, it's not just on the European front that we're looking at this expansion of sort of war drums, because now we've got Korea being used as a patsy in increased tensions with China. The United States sending more aircraft. They did this before Christmas, I think in January as well. Of course, this is all being couched in the language of North Korea, and we've got to do something about North Korea. So the US military planning to deploy 4 F-22s to the Korean Peninsula today, and no idea where they're staying, how long they're staying. The US already having sent bombers across. It's really just, again, baring their teeth. They're not really doing anything. They're sort of growling, but they're not doing anything substantive.
The amount of assets being moved is very small, so this is all a statement of intent. Well, there's no teeth, as you say.
Right. Of course, China not taking this lying down, and as AFP is reporting via the Mail here, they have now put missiles on the Spratly Islands. So surface-to-air missile system. Of course, this is being discovered by a civilian satellite imaging company, ImageSat. Is there any such thing as a civilian satellite imaging company, or perhaps they're contracted?
So, Mike.
Yeah, contracted to the CIA or something. I don't know. But anyway, so this is on top of US. This is sort of in response to not only what's going on in Korea, but on top of US warships constantly sort of being insightful in the southern China Sea. Well, you know, Brian, perhaps this stuff is, all this sort of war drums is there to sort of a bluff to get Russia to accept a settlement in Syria, or to get Russia to accept something else. But I mean, it's a pretty dangerous bluff, particularly if you look at the people that are stoking this situation up. They are increasingly off their heads.
Living their own reality, yeah. I think is the right expression, Mike. But remember that everything that they're trying to do is effectively an agenda of change. If you want to change the politics in Syria, you have to get inside and destabilise. Libya was the same. Iraq, what we're seeing now is that because of what President Putin has done, he's stabilised a country. What they've got to do is destabilise again. This is the same agenda being effectively run in somewhere like the NHS. You've got a huge organisation. They are trying to make a massive change, the privatisation. You need to disrupt it, destabilise it.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I just was thinking about some of the names that we might discuss. Soros is one, obviously. Erdogan, another one. Saakashvili, Obama, Cameron. The NHS, we're being told, is getting lots and lots of money for mental health programs, and I just wonder how many of these people should be on some of that.
On those programs themselves.
Yes.
Well, maybe we should start a campaign for that.
Yeah.
UK call a meeting tonight.
Yes, in the George as usual in Plimpton, 7:30.
7:30. So if anybody is out there locally or within a distance to travel, please come along. We're not only interested, of course, in meeting new people, but we want to hear what you've got to say and what you're experiencing at the moment, particularly in UK.
And just a reminder of Robert Stewart's talk in Frome on the 1st of March at 7:30 p.m. That's in Frome, which is Somerset, yes?
Indeed,
yes. So
traditionally.
Yes. please get along to that if you can. This is going to be an interesting discussion on the evidence which is there to demonstrate how the BBC lied over Saving Syria's Children documentary. That was BBC Panorama.
Right, and this is, of course, a very important subject because the BBC forms just a massive propaganda organisation, and as the UK column is alone in saying BBC's charity, BBC Media Action, openly boasting of its ability to get in and help destabilise countries like Syria. So if you're still donating to the BBC, or you still trust the BBC, have a look at their charity and its political activities. Well, money is key to everything. We've mentioned Soros, and very interesting that Russia today is really hammering Soros. So here's the headline. Putin, I need some glasses for this, sorry. Putin aims at EU disintegration, and the threat from Russia is bigger than that from jihadi attacks. So this is pretty interesting language by Mr. Soros. This is the sort of thing that he's been saying. that American and EU leaders are making a grievous error by taking Russian President Putin for their ally in the fight against Islamic State. He said Putin's real aim is EU disintegration, thank you. And the billionaire also said that the best way to cause the disintegration of the Euro bloc is to flood the EU with Syrian refugees. But we've already shown that many high-level people within the EU have been saying we need the refugees in order to form the European Union superstate.
Indeed. I'll just mention that although it says in that quote from RT that the opinion piece was in Project Syndicate, it was also published by The Guardian in full.
Okay, well, we just add this bit. The race for survival pits the EU against Putin's Russia. ISIS poses a threat to both, but it should not be overestimated. Attacks mounted by jihadi terrorists, however terrifying, do not compare with the threat emanating from Russia. Russia. It's a race against time, but he's obviously got a plan. Soros has obviously got a plan for Mr. Putin, because he says the Putin regime faces bankruptcy in 2017 when a large part of its foreign debt matures and political turmoil may erupt sooner than that. So this is Soros' open society, presumably openly boasting that they're going to get in and
start a colour revolution.
In Russia. And you're also picking up on Soros.
Right. Well, this is Robert Bridge in RT again, and he's saying Soros seriously underestimates his audience by blaming Putin for the EU refugee crisis, and he's saying that the Soros article was, it was covered in Project Syndicate. It was also covered by The Guardian. He's saying that Soros's argument comes down to this: Putin's decision to launch a military offensive in Syria was not to halt the encroachment of Islamic State, the most despicable gang of terrorist thugs to set foot on the world stage, but primarily as a means of dividing Europe. Unsurprisingly, this line of rubbish failed to hoodwink the overwhelming majority of readers, which Soros apparently believes are too ignorant to connect the dots between Syria, Russia and Europe. Indeed, it was sheer entertainment perusing The Guardian's reader comments section following the article, which proves Soros seriously underestimates his audience's grasp of geopolitical issues. My personal favourite anti-Soros jibe came courtesy of Peter Whitelaw, who wrote, "We've been bombing the Middle East off and on for almost 30 years. Russia does it for 2 months, and they're the biggest threat ever. If we're not bombing the Middle East countries, then we're selling arms to them so they can do the bombing instead of us." So and he goes on to comment further on that. Do have a look at this, because it is an interesting piece. So he certainly doesn't believe that Soros managed to pull it off, as it were.
No, and if there's anybody out there not familiar with George Soros, do your own investigation. Have a look on the internet, Open Society, and look at the amounts of money that George Soros boasts that he can bring to the table to help introduce his form of what he calls democracy. So you're talking of a minimum of $2 billion that he's happy to declare with open democracy. Vast amounts of money. And of course, these are all the cells, Mike, that have been used to foment the colour revolutions. We'll be coming on to banking a little bit later, but it's all beginning to fit that the people driving international, European and UK politics all linked to the banks. Well, a man who hasn't been shy of standing forward on this issue is Ken O'Keefe, and he's recently done an interview for Russia Today in which he was happy to say live that President Obama should be tried for treason. And I think our reply to that is well done, Ken, for being outspoken. We would say exactly the same thing about David Cameron, should certainly be brought into a court and tried for treason, because as we can see day by day, David Cameron not only fomenting unlawful wars overseas, but also dismantling UK and the constitution of UK. Well, just have a look at some of the things that Ken O'Keefe said. If you really want to know the truth about the invasion in Iraq, then there are certainly incentives. Securing oil was one of them. But he says far less talked about really is Israeli plans for the balkanization of surrounding countries, and particularly Iraq. And he then goes on to talk about a program of destabilizing all the areas surrounding Israel, including Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and even Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And the long-term goal is part of the Greater Israel Project. So the weapon is divide and rule. And if you can create chaos, of course, then you prevent these countries and nation states having proper foreign policy and forming relations. But in the interview, Ken O'Keefe also links it in and says that basically people are beginning to wake up to the reality of their enslavement by big money. And of course, George Soros would be part of that. Well, let's take a jump across to UK matters. And a few people have been asking me what has been happening with Beechwood child abuse whistleblower Melanie Shaw. Melanie has been back in court. I think she's actually in court in Nottingham while we speak, awaiting sentencing on a variety of charges, mainly harassment, that have been levelled at her since she left prison. Melanie is extremely worried at the prospect of being sent back to prison, but it looks as though the possibility is that she will be given some form of suspended sentence. But we're literally waiting to hear from her at any time now as to what the outcome of that case is. Remember, of course, that Melanie Shaw, very brave, stepped forward to talk about not only her own abuse, but that of other children within the Nottingham Beechwood children's home. That then led to the so-called Operation Daybreak, an investigation by Nottingham police. All was going well until Melanie discovered, of course, that Nottinghamshire police were lying over investigations which they claimed they'd carried out. Clearly they had not. And it was at that point that the establishment turned on Melanie Shaw, and within a short space of time she's had her life wrecked, her child taken away from her, and ultimately put in prison after a number of court cases with no proper representation or jury. Now, what is the significance of all of these events around child abuse? Well, this headline gives us part of the clue, because during one of the trials for Melanie Shaw, the judge claimed that Operation Daybreak was simply a conspiracy theory. And we've recently had the Metropolitan Police apparently claiming that Operation Midland, the investigation into high-level paedophiles, simply didn't exist. So we'll remember this lady who has been hauled through the coals, as it were, simply for being a victim and having the bravery to speak out. Why is the establishment so frightened? Well, let's bring in the Daily Mail, because we've got a very interesting headline that the MI5 chief's family have blasted the Met for refusing to discuss child abuse probe with them, and even claiming the inquiry didn't exist. Remarkable similarity there, Mike, that
just a coincidence.
No, these inquiries were set up, but they don't actually exist. But the nub of this is that the family are uptight that claims of abuse have been made against Michael Handley, who died in 2002. But of course, he was head of MI5, very important man, and if he was involved in abuse of children, of course, this drags in the security services. Well, we just digress slightly, but we will bring you back to this theme of the significance of child abuse. Let's switch to this, and this is another Daily Mail report where an American firm is boasting that they've now got a robotic ship which is capable of going to sea for long periods of time to hunt diesel-electric submarines. And the significance of this is that while Russians, British and Americans have built up large nuclear submarine fleets, the, we'll say, old-fashioned diesel-electric boats, of course, origins are the German U-boats, these are still very effective units at sea because they are so difficult to detect. Well, the Americans have said that basically these new devices, these new ships can go and track diesel-electric submarines for months at a time, and they're getting very excited because they've been able to track one at about half a mile. Now, from my own experience in matters to do with anti-submarine warfare, there seems to be a lot of hype in this whole article. But this is the bit I wanted to really draw your attention to, so we'll bring it on screen. The bogeyman, because in the article it stresses that naughty President Putin, Mike, has been selling diesel-electric submarines to buoy up its shipyards, triggering what some are calling an undersea arms race. So the article starts off with high tech, but in it we get the dig. It's Russia that's causing the problem because they're selling diesel-electric submarines. Well, it's interesting that, of course, it was UK who was probably leading the field in diesel-electric submarines. We're jumping back now to the mid-90s or the early 90s, where Britain developed the Upholder class, really excellent submarines despite some teething troubles. But what happened was these submarines were then sold to the Canadians, and to the astonishment of many people in Britain's military, certainly the Royal Navy, people said this is madness because we need these submarines. So now we've got a backdrop that anybody who's operating diesel-electric submarines is a threat to world security. And who's driving this cunning plan? Well, it's none other than President Putin. So why did we get rid of the submarines? Well, in 1993-94, there were a whole lot of surveys done, 33 of them, interesting number, but there we go. And it was looking at ways of cutting costs around the military, and everything was looked at, from changing the central staff, the formation of a permanent joint headquarters, the restructuring of land command. These are part of the objectives from one of the real documents on screen at the moment. But essentially what was going on here was that these changes were destabilising the whole of the UK's military system, and we can now see that this has led towards further cuts and change in the driving to the creation of the European military. There's other documents on this, so don't believe us, have a look at it yourself. But if we follow it through, it becomes very interesting. So here's comment from www.parliament.uk. And what are we interested in? Well, we're interested in the Secretary of State back in 1993, essentially saying that in these changes there was going to be a reduction in British anti-submarine warfare capability. Well, who was the man? It was none other than Mr. Rifkin, later to resign in disgrace because he was apparently trying to do dirty deals with Chinese corporations. And he also had to resign from the Defence Intelligence Committee. So as a result of his programme, the Nimrods were scrapped. Again, this caused huge problems and a massive cut in capability. We got rid of the anti-submarine carriers. They weren't really aircraft carriers, they were anti-submarine vehicles. And it was only the UK column that said back in 2011, we know where this is going. It's the creation of the EU military. So we've chosen the Spectator here with the headline, Britain's armed forces no longer have the resources for a major war. Just think of that, Mike, against the backdrop that you've painted. We're seeing the world is apparently getting more and more dangerous, yet Britain, in the face of this terrible Mr. Putin, is cutting its armed forces. Why are they cutting the British armed forces? Because the agenda, as the Express is pointing out here, is that the EU army is to be developed. Well, how does this link in with Mr. Heath and the children? Well, of course, it was Edward Heath that by stealth took us into the EEC, and, well, no child abuse, nothing to see, apparently. But of course, what's really going on in the background is blackmail, and whoever the powers are that know where the paedophiles are, they control the show. So I think we'd like to say that, of course, our security services and police special branch are absolutely in the paedophile club because they cannot possibly not know what's happening, and it's their knowledge and silence which forms the magic circle controlling the high-level abusers. Was Heath blackmailed into taking us into the EU? I think there's a strong possibility, Mike. And I think that what we're seeing now is a massive attempt by the establishment to cover up. On that line, it's interesting that Exaro here is busy trying to push the public across to, no, this is just a matter of celebrities inside the BBC. And we had this extraordinary situation where a major internal report into paedophiles in the BBC just happened to be leaked to Exaro. So no paedophiles in Westminster, Mike. They were all in the BBC, and it was years ago anyway. Well, we get a clue from the Mail, because the Mail is doing exactly the same thing. Top secret papers reveal flagrant plot threatening to out Prime Minister Ted Heath as gay. And what's really going on here is you're nudging this across. So there wasn't any child abuse. There's nothing to see. Ted Heath was really a poor, victimised homosexual. Well, somebody sent us a nice email which said, watch out for what's happening. It said that the most immediate principal and primary tactical objective of the EU is to acquire an army, navy and air force, at which point it can then proceed quickly to the next tactical objective, a greater treasury. That's happening, at which point it can then proceed to implement the final strategy of full political union. Powers putting this together, Mike, would they stop at blackmail using the abuse of children? I don't think so.
No, but they're really up against it in terms of time. Because they don't have much time left.
No, so we're starting to see things coming to the surface, which are pretty obvious. We're moving towards a European super-state, a dictatorship. The French are taking us there fairly quickly, I think.
Well, they're certainly taking their own people there fairly quickly, and they have yet again extended their state of emergency, this time to May. So it looks like they're just going to keep extending this and extending this. Alex Thompson has mentioned this a number of times. So they voted to extend the country's state of emergency. And of course, that was brought in after the so-called terror attacks in Paris last November. They voted 212 to 31 with 3 abstentions. And that was a day after the Senate approved the extension by an overwhelming majority as well. So there you go. The French politicians, at least, don't seem to be too unhappy about living in a dictatorship.
No. And of course, friend of Cameron. I don't think Mr. Cameron would be upset with speeding up the British dictatorship either.
Right, finance then. So we've got another PSYOP going on here because we're expected to believe that Sir John Vickers and the Bank of England are unhappy with each other, but they're just playing games, I think. So just to quote the beginning of this FT article, it says, in the red corner is Sir John Vickers, Chief Architect of the UK banking reforms, who says the Bank of England has gone soft on how much capital banks should have to hold in order to avoid another financial crisis. And in the blue corner is the Bank of England, specifically Andrew Bailey and Sir John Cunliffe, 2 deputy governors who reject Sir John's criticism and say the bank has gone further than his prescriptions. Now, his prescriptions come out of the Independent Commission on Banking, which Sir John Vickers chaired in 2010, and he released his report in September 2011. Of course, this was all coming out of the financial crash 2007-2008, and he said in a letter to the FT that top Bank of England officials had been watering down his recommendations. Now, in fact, although he's correct in his criticism, the fact that he's in no position to criticise really, because his ring fence, which was the outcome of the Independent Commission on Banking, really isn't going to work, and it's already been watered down to the point of uselessness in any case. So the ring fence was envisaged to prevent banks from using individual savings accounts, that's our savings accounts, for speculative purposes. Except the new proposals mean that banks can transfer our savings in the form of dividends instead of in the form of cash. So, in other words, just as we at the UK Column have been warning since the word ring fence was first bandied about, the ring fence is full of holes. And the Bank of England can pretend to its heart's content that it's doing more than's demanded of it by the Vickers report, but this demonstrates that the bank can't be trusted. So Vickers ended up by saying that given the awfulness of systemic bank failures, ample insurance is needed. Equity is the best form of insurance. The recent volatility in bank stocks underlines the importance of strong capital buffers. The Bank of England should think again. Well, I think the Bank of England should be taken out of the equation altogether and regulatory responsibility removed from it completely. And then the commercial banks should be broken up. And, that's what many people told Vickers at the time. And it should be no surprise to him now that his insistence that it should be no surprise to him now that the ring fence isn't working, because it was never enough. The banks should be split up and get rid of too big to fail.
The cartel's got to go.
Which indeed is exactly what a new incumbent at the Federal Reserve Bank seems to be saying. So this is the Washington Examiner reporting this, and they're talking about Neil Kashkari, who is the new president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and he said in a speech on Tuesday that the Federal Reserve need to give serious consideration to a range of options, including breaking up large banks into smaller, less connected, less important entities. He didn't mention the words Glass-Steagall, of course, but nonetheless, that's what he's talking about. And he said the biggest banks are still too big to fail and continue to pose a significant ongoing risk to our economy, despite the Dodd-Frank Act. And of course, the Dodd-Frank Act is equivalent pretty much to Vickers' ring fence. It really doesn't do the job.
Okay.
So that's that.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of our first UK column news from the new studio. A very interesting experience it's been. We'll just say, though, that Justin Walker from the British Constitution Group has been on the road extremely early this morning to get down to London. He's been meeting up with some of the financial advisors to Jeremy Corbyn, and what's on the table for discussion is the Bradbury Pound. So fairly shortly, on the subject of proper national currency, a reintroduction of the Bradbury Pound, we should be able to give you the line on what Corbyn and Labour think about the possibility of going for a reintroduction of the Bradbury Pound, which of course with proper ring fencing of the banks, breaking up of the banks and Glass-Steagall, could start to make a major change to what's actually happening in this country and worldwide. So stay posted on that. Lastly, we'll just give a big thanks to all the people that helped us in our move. We'd especially like to thank the electrician that came in and our carpet fitter, friends and those who've helped with removals. Thank you very much for doing all you've done. It all seems to be working, so we'll just keep our fingers crossed that it stays like that. Well, that's it for today. If you are wondering what can you do to stop this, our advice at the moment is stay focused on the European referendum. There's going to be a massive government psychological operation to convince people that the European Union is a benign organisation. What can you do? Very easy. Talk to people, spread the word, get on the social networks, warn people what the European Union really is. It is a dictatorship. It's being brought in by stealth. It's treason by David Cameron and his government in Westminster. Talk to other people and warn them. If there's a no vote, it is going to cause massive and very good change in this country. And we've been hearing from sources at Westminster ends that David Cameron's days appear numbered, even if the vote for Europe goes through. Seems to be getting really quite interesting. And we also understand that the spotlight is beginning to turn on Oliver Letwin. Now, of course, Oliver Letwin MP is the man we've consistently warned is part of the cabal running government. It's not David Cameron. He's simply a media puppet. The man to look for is Oliver Letwin, assisted by Francis Maude. Talk to people, warn them, talk about what's really happening in the country, and perhaps we can say above all, get people to look at other sources of news, certainly not the BBC. Is that it, Mike?
Yep.
I think it is. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.